Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the Ruy Lopez, beginning with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 begins the Ruy Lopez, and we're going to be talking about, I guess, a try from black. I don't know if I should even call it an interesting try. Something called the Spanish Countergambit, where black decides to play d5 right here. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on the notification icon. So it shocks me that this move even has a name, because it looks like it's just a blunder. Like when I checked my database, I couldn't really find any strong players that had ever played this move. Like all of the games were between class players like 1300 to 1700 and stuff like that. I mean, it just amazes me that we bothered to name this and that we dared to call it a gambit. I mean, it's not a gambit. It's just a blunder. It's just hanging material. Okay, so if anybody ever does this against you, d5, the obvious problem with it is that there's this pin here, and knight takes e5 is a move. Okay, and you can play it, so you should. So just play knight takes e5. There's no reason to decline this so-called gambit, but I don't even understand how it's a gambit, because typically in a gambit you give up something and you get something in return. This is the opposite. You give up something and in return white gets something. White has a double attack on c6. White has an aggressive outpost on e5. White is still more developed than black. White has two pieces out. Black only has one. So, and white is one move away from castling as well. So white's king is going to end up being safer in this position. So this is the opposite of a gambit. You've given up a pawn, and in exchange for that, white has I could probably give up these two pawns over here, and I could still declare that my position is better. So white has compensation for the pawn that black just sacrificed. So this opening makes zero sense to me, the fact that it even has a name. But okay, so let's just talk about some things that black could do from here and how we would move forward and just basically crush this. The most logical kind of looking move would be something like bishop d7, just to break the pin and defend everything. But of course here, obviously, black is much, much worse. We don't have to analyze this terribly deeply, because we could even just play bishop takes c6, and then after something like bc6, we could just castle, d takes c4, knight c3, and we have a very, very clear advantage. So like even if they play a move like pawn to f5, we would have queen h5, g6, knight g6, knight f6, queen h4. We're completely winning in every possible way that we could be completely winning. And again, obviously they can't play, h takes g6 here. We have queen takes h8. We're just winning the whole rook. And I mean, these are all very well-known types of tactics. So bishop c6 is easy enough. Really, knight d7 is probably a little better, but just as good. Like knight d7, queen d7 takes, and then we do have to kind of be careful about how we castle, because we'd like to just castle here. And if you play knight c3 and then queen g2, obviously at that point black does have a little bit of compensation for the material. So you would have to find the move queen to e2 check, which defends the bishop on b5 and prepares to castle. So after queen e2 check, we have bishop e7, simply castles kingside. Decisive advantage white. White has an extra pawn. We're going to play knight to c3 next, gaining another tempo. Everything is held. Everything is fine. So that's another way to go. You can play knight d7, queen d7, knight d7, queen d7, e d5, queen e2 check, bishop e7, castles. Decisive advantage white. So bishop d7, one way or another, either if you just play bishop c6 or if you play knight takes d7, should be decisive advantage white. But what if black really thinks he's playing a gambit? Like you play knight takes e5, what's a counter gambit? What is a gambit? Well, we have to play kind of gambity. We have to play for aggressive counter-attacking chances. Queen g5 and queen d6 are the only two logical tries to play for aggressive counter-attacking chances. Now, queen d6 is kind of interesting. Well, I won't even say interesting, because obviously white's still better. And white's actually so much better that this blunder, knight takes c6, I was actually just doing a little bit of research. This position was reached. A 1300 was playing the white pieces, and a 1700 was playing black. And after this move, knight to c6, which is not the best move, by the way, it actually gives up most of white's advantage, the 1300 still managed to win. because white's position is just so much better. Like after knight c6, bishop c6, bishop d3, white still just has an extra pawn essentially for nothing. And, black's pawn, on top of that, black's pawn structure is not good. Black's queen is misplaced. So it's not even white has an extra pawn for nothing. White actually got an extra pawn plus positional compensation. Even with knight c6, bc6, bishop d3, he's still up more than a pawn here. And a 1300 was able to beat a 1700 from here. So after queen d6, though, the best move is just to play d4, maintain all of your advantages. And then we would have something like d takes e4, knight c3, a6, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes e4, decisive advantage white. Again, the amount of extra compensation that you have on top of being up the pawn is really massive. White has a massive position plus being up a pawn. So it's up a pawn and then some. So up a pawn and then positional compensation on top of that. So white should have just a decisive advantage here. So after knight takes e5, what else? Queen g5. So we can try to mix things up with this, and this looks really gambity. We have queen attacking e5, queen attacking g2, and certainly against certain responses here, black would have quite a bit of compensation. So like if we go in for knight c6 after queen g2, black is actually going to have quite a bit of compensation. It's a little bit of an unclear position. But if you just remember this one move, the game is practically over on the spot. That's just retreating this knight, moving it backwards. Just play knight f3, just attack the queen. You're threatening the queen, and you're also threatening e takes d5. And queen to g2 is not really much of a threat. After queen takes g2, we have rook g1, gaining another tempo against that queen. And then when the queen logically retreats, queen h3, now we play e takes d5, and you're simply attacking that pinned knight. And more importantly, there's never going to be any real threat against your knight. Like even after bishop to g4, at any moment you can play rook g3 and break the pressure against your knight. Now right now you don't even have to do that. You can play queen e2 check first, knight on g to e7, and then you can simply take on c6. The whole point being is that they don't have time to play bishop takes f3, because you're going to be playing takes on b7 with check, and then after queen blocks, which is apparently the only move that doesn't just immediately lose on the spot, you're going to have something like queen f3, rook b8 takes, and you're up a whole queen. Interestingly enough, like the best computer move here is instead of queen f3 to play queen d3, and this is apparently even more devastating, like queen b5, king d8, we take and make a new queen, but then we check and we pick up the bishop on a8. So this is supposed to be also completely, utterly winning. So I don't know where this leaves me here. So we have queen g5, knight f3. I mean, is there anything else? We have queen takes g2, rook g1, queen h3 takes, bishop to g4, queen e2, knight on g to e7, dc6. If they don't play bishop takes f3, they could try something like castles kingside. But again, the threat was just to consolidate with rook g3, and that's exactly what white should do here. White should just play rook g3, queen h5, then just take on b7. We have king b8, and then what the computer gives here is kind of interesting. The computer wants to sacrifice the exchange and free up the knight. The point being is that when the knight goes to e5, the position should be pretty decisive. So like rook g4, queen g4, now d4, etching out that e5 square, knight d5, knight e5, forcing the exchange of queens. And now there's this dual threat. There's this threat of knight f7 and knight c6. And then the whole point is that you can't really sidestep these threats, because if the king takes the pawn, for example, you have bishop c6, king c8, and then knight takes f7, and we're forking both the rooks, but we're also holding the e8 square. So there's not going to be an in-between rook e8 check. So at this point, they have to give us the exchange back. Once they give us the exchange back, we're up. I mean, we can just do the math here. So like after bishop to d6, for example, knight takes a8, rook takes h8, bishop d5, we're up a mountain of pieces. We're up 1, 2 pieces, plus we've got a bunch of pawns. This is pretty much just game over. So, I mean, this would just be like a for instance. I'm sure there's slightly better moves here for black, but one way or another, we're going to be up at least a whole piece and a couple of pawns. So, basically, the Spanish Countergambit, d5, most of what you have to remember is just knight takes e5 is winning, and if they play queen g5, just play knight f3 and you're winning. So that's basically what you have to remember. You should have just an absolutely decisive advantage after knight takes e5, and if queen to g5, knight f3 is still decisive advantage white. Everything else, you really should just be able to figure it out. And just keep in mind, every single position in these lines, according to the engine, is decisive advantage white. So, anyways, I hope you found these ideas helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.